My brother was dying in hospice. Across the hall, an old woman had no visitors. I brought her muffins and talked with her. The night before my nephew arrived, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Drive home tonight if you can." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Calvin, 63 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday evening, I believed blood meant loyalty. Sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room of Oakwood Care Center, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of my older brother Gordon's oxygen concentrator. Gordon was losing his battle with pancreatic cancer. For 3 weeks, I had essentially lived in that plastic armchair beside his bed. I managed his medications, smoothed his blankets, and listened to his fading breaths. He was completely unresponsive now. I was exhausted, surviving on stale vending machine coffee and sheer willpower. I expected his son Tyler to arrive from Seattle the following morning. Tyler had always been conveniently absent during the grueling months of chemotherapy, claiming his tech startup required his undivided attention. I gave him a pass because Gordon loved his only child, blinding himself to Tyler's deep-seated selfishness. Across the linoleum corridor in room 412, a 90-year-old woman named Beatrice resided in absolute isolation. In the entire time I had been vigilantly watching over Gordon, not a single person had crossed her threshold. No family, no friends, just the nurses doing their mandatory rounds. I started bringing her homemade blueberry muffins a week prior. Baking was my quiet escape, a brief return to normalcy in my own kitchen before driving back to the hospice. I would drop a warm muffin on her tray, sit for 10 minutes, and listen to her sharp, witty observations about the hospital staff. Beatrice was physically frail, confined to her bed, but her mind remained dangerously sharp. She possessed a terrifyingly clear awareness of her surroundings. She knew exactly who was being abandoned and who was merely putting on a show for the inheritance. That evening, a heavy rainstorm began battering the hospice windows. I stood up, stretching the stiff ache out of my spine, preparing to head home for my first full night of sleep in days. Tyler had called earlier, assuring me he was already at a nearby hotel and would take over the morning shift. He told me to go rest, insisting I had done more than enough. His voice had carried a smooth, practiced empathy that I desperately wanted to believe. I packed my heavy wool coat, gave Gordon one last gentle squeeze on his frail shoulder, and stepped out into the quiet hallway. I intended to simply wave goodnight to Beatrice from the doorway. As I passed room 412, I noticed her reading lamp was still on. She was sitting upright, her thin frame rigid against the pillows. Her pale eyes locked onto me the second my shadow crossed her threshold. I stepped inside to ask if she needed a nurse. Before I could even formulate the question, her bony hand shot out with a speed and strength that defied her fragile appearance. Her fingers clamped around my wrist like a vice. Her grip was astonishingly tight, her knuckles white. She pulled me down closer to her face. Her breath smelled of peppermint and clinical antiseptics. "Calvin," she whispered, her voice a raspy, urgent hiss. "Drive home tonight if you can. Do not wait for the morning." I stared at her, completely confused. I gently tried to pry my wrist from her iron grip, but she held firm. I asked her what she meant. Her eyes darted toward the empty hallway, confirming we were entirely alone before she spoke again. She explained that 2 hours ago, my nephew Tyler had been standing right outside her open door. He thought she was asleep. He thought she was just another deaf, senile ghost waiting to pass on. He was arguing on his cell phone with his wife, Monica. Beatrice recounted the entire conversation, verbatim, her memory functioning like a steel trap. Tyler had arrived in town a day early. He was not resting at a hotel. He was actively mobilizing a coordinated strike against my property. Beatrice's voice dropped even lower, trembling with intense urgency. She said Tyler gave Monica the exact address to your house on Elm Street. He told her the commercial dumpster was already paid for and scheduled for delivery by midnight. He instructed Monica to bring the heavy-duty trash bags. Then Beatrice relayed the final devastating detail. Tyler was finalizing an emergency appointment with a locksmith. He intended to change the digital security codes on your front gates and replace all the deadbolts before sunrise. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me. I stopped trying to pull my wrist away. The humming of the medical equipment around us seemed to fade into a vacuum of absolute silence. My mind raced, piecing together the fragmented puzzle of Tyler's recent behavior. Tyler had asked me for a spare key to my house last week, claiming he needed a place to store his luggage to avoid paying for a hotel room. I had declined, citing the mess I had left behind, but he knew I had been living at the hospice. He knew my house was sitting completely empty and unprotected. Beatrice released my wrist, sinking back into her pillows. Her chest heaved with the effort of delivering the warning. She told me Tyler bragged on the phone about a document. He claimed Gordon had signed over something critical before slipping into the coma. Tyler told his wife the estate was legally theirs now, and they needed to purge your belongings immediately to prepare the property for a quick sale. He called you a squatter in your own family home. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My house on Elm Street never belonged to Gordon. 5 years ago, anticipating Tyler's destructive gambling habits, Gordon and I executed a complex legal maneuver. Gordon transferred his entire estate into a blind trust legally managed and controlled exclusively by me to protect his assets from his son. Tyler had no idea the trust existed. He assumed Gordon still held partial equity in my property. Tyler was attempting a hostile takeover of a house he believed he was inheriting, armed with what I could only assume were completely forged documents. I thanked Beatrice, my voice barely more than a whisper. I promised her I would return to check on her tomorrow. She simply nodded, closing her eyes, her duty fulfilled. I stepped back into the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly felt blinding, exposing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Tyler was not here to comfort his dying father. He had arrived early to scavenge the remains while Gordon's heart was still beating. I did not walk to the elevator. I broke into a full sprint toward the emergency stairwell. I bypassed the lobby, entirely bursting out the side doors into the freezing, torrential rain. The freezing drops soaked through my wool coat instantly, but I felt absolutely nothing. My car sat alone in the dark visitor parking lot. I unlocked the door, sliding behind the wheel with a singular, terrifying focus. I started the engine. The roar of the motor cutting through the storm. I lived exactly 2 hours away from the hospice center. It was currently 10:30 at night. If Beatrice's timeline was accurate, Tyler and Monica were already at my property. They were violating the sanctity of my home, tossing decades of my life into a rented dumpster, armed with fraudulent papers and a profound underestimation of the man they were attempting to rob. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles cracked. I did not feel sorrow for my nephew. I did not feel the crushing grief of my brother's impending death. I felt a cold, calculated clarity. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the parking lot, the tires gripping the wet asphalt. Tyler expected to find a devastated, exhausted old man weeping by a hospital bed until morning. He expected a smooth, uncontested robbery. He was about to discover exactly what happens when you corner a man who holds all the keys, all the trust documents, and absolutely zero remaining patience. The drive home would take 2 hours. The silent adjustment of my nephew's arrogant reality was about to begin. The tires of my truck skidded slightly on the slick asphalt as I turned onto my street. The rain was coming down in relentless sheets, washing out the glow of the streetlights. 2 hours of white-knuckle driving from the hospice center had left my hands cramped and my shoulders aching. I pulled up to my property and slammed on the brakes. A massive yellow commercial dumpster sat squarely in the middle of my driveway. It was positioned deliberately to block my usual parking spot. I cut the engine and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The front floodlights were blazing, illuminating a scene that defied all rational logic. My nephew Tyler was standing on the front porch holding a heavy black trash bag. His wife Monica stood beside him, barking orders and pointing toward the open front door. They were systematically emptying my home. I walked slowly up the concrete path, the rain soaking through my clothes. The contents of the dumpster were clearly visible under the harsh security lights. Piles of my tailored winter coats lay ruined in the sludge. Beneath them, I saw the shattered sleeves of my vintage vinyl records. The collection had taken me 40 years to build. Those albums were the only things I kept from my early days working as a sound engineer in the city. Tyler tossed another bag over the metal rim. It landed with a heavy thud, splitting open to reveal my personal accounting files and framed photographs. He turned around and finally noticed me standing at the bottom of the porch steps. He did not look surprised. He did not look ashamed. He smirked. "Uncle Calvin," he said, wiping wet hair from his forehead, "I thought you were staying at the hospice until the bitter end." Monica stepped forward, clutching a waterproof clipboard against her chest. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. Tyler pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. The paper was protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. He walked down the steps and shoved it directly into my chest. "You need to read this very carefully, Uncle Calvin. My father signed over his entire half of the property equity to me this afternoon." I stared at the document. It was a heavily notarized power of attorney and a quitclaim deed. The signature at the bottom purported to belong to my brother Gordon. It was a flawless forgery. Gordon had been in a medically induced coma for 3 days. His hands were swollen with edema and hooked to intravenous lines. He lacked the physical capacity to hold a pen, let alone execute complex real estate transfers. Tyler pointed to a gold foil seal at the bottom of the page. The notary stamp belonged to a private contractor Monica used for her real estate business. They had orchestrated a complete fabrication while I was sitting by my dying brother's bedside. The ink on the paper was practically still wet. Tyler crossed his arms, stepping closer to invade my personal space. "The house is legally mine now," he declared. "My father wanted to ensure his legacy was protected from your mismanagement. I have immediate legal authority to liquidate this estate to cover his final medical expenses. We both know you cannot afford to buy out his half. You need to hand over your house keys right now. You have until dawn to collect whatever garbage you want from the guest room and vacate the premises." Monica chimed in, her voice shrill over the sound of the rain. "We have a staging crew arriving at 8 in the morning," she announced. "We are listing the property by Friday. If you cause a scene or refuse to leave, we will call the local police and have you forcibly removed for trespassing." Tyler smiled again, adding that he would also press charges for elder abuse. He claimed he would tell the authorities I had been neglecting Gordon's medical bills and hoarding his assets. They had fabricated an entire narrative designed to paint me as a criminal in my own home. They had clearly rehearsed this speech, anticipating a massive emotional breakdown on my part. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They had weaponized my brother's terminal illness to orchestrate a home invasion. I looked at the forged signature again. Tyler assumed Gordon and I bought this house together decades ago as co-signers. He assumed Gordon retained a 50% equity stake. He based his entire criminal conspiracy on a fundamental misunderstanding of our financial history. I did not correct him. I did not yell or demand an explanation. I did not defend my honor or threaten to call my lawyer. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against people who expect a screaming match. I handed the plastic sleeve back to Tyler. I walked right past him, climbing the porch steps with steady, measured strides. Monica stepped in front of the door, trying to block my path. I did not break my pace. I looked directly into her eyes, forcing her to step aside or be knocked over. She flinched, moving out of the doorway at the very last second. I stepped into my foyer. The interior of the house had been completely ransacked. My antique rugs were rolled up and shoved into the corner. My bookshelves had been emptied, their contents dumped haphazardly into cardboard boxes. They had moved with ruthless efficiency, operating under the assumption that I would not return until after Gordon drew his final breath. I ignored the chaos in the living room. I ignored Tyler shouting from the porch, demanding that I stop walking. I headed straight for the hallway leading to the basement stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness. I flicked on the overhead fluorescent bulb. The basement was exactly as I had left it, untouched by their greedy hands. They had focused entirely on the valuable items upstairs, ignoring the dusty workbench in the corner. I walked over to the heavy steel table. It was covered in old engine parts and disorganized tools. I grabbed the edge of the heavy table and pushed it aside with a loud metallic screech against the concrete floor. Behind the workbench, a false panel in the drywall concealed a recessed compartment. I punched a 6-digit code into the electronic keypad hidden behind the panel. A heavy steel door clicked open. Inside the dark cavity sat a single fireproof lockbox. I pulled it out, gripping the sturdy handle. The box was heavy, loaded with the master corporate trust documents Gordon and I had executed 5 years ago. The paperwork inside explicitly proved that Gordon owned absolutely zero equity in this physical property. Tyler wanted to play a high-stakes legal game using forged documents, committing federal fraud to steal an illusion. He had no idea he was stepping into a financial minefield I had meticulously laid out to protect my brother's legacy. I tucked the lockbox under my arm. I turned around and headed back toward the stairs, ready to initiate a total financial lockdown. The rain-slicked highway gave way to the buzzing neon sign of a roadside motel. I pulled my car under a rusting metal canopy, leaving the engine running as I paid the indifferent night clerk in cash. He handed me a brass key for a room at the far end of the desolate lot. I drove over, parked, and stepped out into the freezing downpour, clutching the heavy steel lockbox against my chest. The room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. I threw the deadbolt, locked the chain, and dragged a heavy oak dresser directly in front of the door. My clothes were soaked, clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but I ignored the chill. I placed the lockbox squarely on the center of the sagging mattress. The cold metal felt grounding under my fingertips. This impenetrable container held the absolute truth, protecting my brother's legacy from the predators currently occupying my home. The brass combination dial clicked with satisfying precision as I aligned the numbers. I snapped the heavy latches upward and threw open the lid. The distinct scent of aged parchment and specialized legal ink filled the damp room. I carefully lifted a thick stack of professionally bound documents. At the very top lay the master formation charter for the Gordon Family Protective Trust. Tyler operated under the profoundly arrogant assumption of a standard joint tenancy agreement. He believed his father maintained a 50% equity stake in my property. He never once bothered to search the county clerk records to verify his own inheritance. 5 years ago, Gordon sat at my kitchen table weeping uncontrollably into his hands. He confessed that Tyler had secretly remortgaged his own home to feed a severe offshore sports betting addiction. Gordon recognized his son was a relentless financial predator. To prevent Tyler from liquidating his legacy, Gordon voluntarily severed his property equity. He transferred every single asset he owned into an irrevocable blind trust. He appointed me as the sole fiduciary executor. I possessed absolute legal control over his entire estate. Tyler was currently invading a house he had zero legal claim to, armed with worthless forged papers. I pulled my laptop from my leather satchel and booted it up on the rickety laminate desk. The motel internet connection was agonizingly slow, forcing me to wait tense minutes as the secure banking portal loaded. I typed in my highly encrypted credentials. The dual-factor authentication pinged my cellular phone. I entered the 6-digit security code, and the comprehensive dashboard materialized on the screen. A bright red warning banner immediately flashed across the top of the browser. The primary medical reserve account showed a critically low balance. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I clicked directly on the transaction history tab. Line after line of massive, unauthorized withdrawals populated the glowing screen. Someone had systematically drained $50,000 over the past 72 hours. I scrutinized the specific routing details. The money had not been transferred to a standard external checking account. It was being pulled rapidly through a secondary debit card. I had never authorized the issuance of a secondary card. Tyler had clearly intercepted a piece of his father's mail months ago, forging Gordon's signature to request a duplicate card linked directly to the medical escrow. He was bypassing the trust's standard security protocols by attacking the liquid reserve fund meant exclusively to pay for the expensive hospice facility. I opened the pending transactions ledger. My blood ran completely cold. The weekly automated payment scheduled for the care center had been rejected for insufficient funds. The digital notice glared at me in stark red lettering. The checks keeping my brother comfortable, keeping his oxygen machines running, and his pain medication flowing, were actively bouncing. Tyler was not just stealing an early inheritance. He was actively bankrupting his father's vital life support. He was pulling the financial plug from a distance while standing in my driveway, demanding the keys to a house he did not own. The sheer entitlement required to siphon money from a dying man defied human decency. Tyler had likely stood by his father's bedside, feigning tears, while secretly memorizing the account routing numbers printed on the hospice billing statements. The betrayal was layered, deeply calculated, and utterly devoid of empathy. I reviewed the digital logs tracking the exact network addresses used to access the secondary card portal. The geographic coordinates matched Tyler's expensive downtown apartment. He had executed the initial theft days before Gordon's condition deteriorated, proving this was a premeditated strike, not an impulsive act of grief. I downloaded the entire transaction history, generating a comprehensive digital report. I encrypted the file and saved it to an external flash drive. This data was no longer just a bank statement. It was pristine, unassailable evidence of felony wire fraud. I dug deeper into the specific merchants listed next to the fraudulent charges, trying to map his movements. $10,000 had been wired to an untraceable offshore holding company. $5,000 was spent at a high-end jewelry boutique downtown. A massive pending authorization hold for $35,000 sat at the very top of the ledger. The specific merchant identifier belonged to an elite luxury auto dealership located just outside the city limits. Tyler was attempting to purchase a high-performance sports car using the stolen medical funds. He was literally liquidating his father's physical comfort to buy an arrogant status symbol for himself. I felt a profound, icy calm wash over my entire body. I did not feel the sudden urge to scream or throw things at the motel walls. I felt the absolute chilling clarity of a man holding a loaded weapon with the safety switched off. I navigated to the advanced security settings within the banking portal. I located the forged secondary debit card in the active device registry. With a single deliberate click, I reported the card as stolen due to extreme fraudulent activity. The banking system instantly terminated the card, making it entirely useless plastic. I did not stop there. I initiated a total protocol lockdown on the entire trust network. I froze every liquid asset, every long-term investment portfolio, and every emergency reserve account. I restricted all outbound wire transfers. I changed the master passwords, generating a complex string of randomized characters. I altered the security recovery questions to obscure details only Gordon and I would ever know. The system generated a final confirmation screen, verifying that all accounts were now permanently locked under a strict federal fraud hold. No money could move in or out without my physical presence inside a bank branch, bearing dual photo identification and notarized authorization. The trap was fully constructed, armed, and waiting for the predator to step blindly into the jaws. Tyler was currently standing in my house, tossing my precious memories into a rented dumpster, believing he had won the ultimate war. He believed he was a wealthy, unassailable heir about to drive a luxury vehicle off a dealership lot at dawn. He had absolutely no idea his entire financial reality had just been systematically obliterated by a few targeted keystrokes in a cheap roadside motel. I closed the laptop. The screen faded to pitch black, plunging the small room back into heavy shadows. I sat in the dim light, listening to the relentless rain batter the thin glass window. I leaned back in the wooden chair, waiting patiently for morning, knowing exactly what would happen the second Tyler tried to swipe that stolen card. The harsh morning light filtered through the cheap polyester curtains of the motel room, casting long gray shadows across the stained carpet. I sat perfectly still in the creaking wooden chair, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The banking portal remained open, displaying the absolute freeze I had executed hours prior. The heavy storm had finally passed, leaving behind a thick, humid silence in the desolate parking lot outside. I knew my nephew intimately. I knew his impulsive, insatiable appetite for immediate gratification. Tyler lacked the fundamental discipline required to quietly hoard his stolen wealth. He required an audience. He required a physical manifestation of his newly acquired status to validate his massive ego. I did not expect him to pay off his mounting offshore gambling debts. I fully expected him to attempt a massive, ostentatious purchase the second the sun came up. My cellular phone sat beside the laptop, resting on the scratched laminate desk. At exactly 9:14 in the morning, the digital screen illuminated brightly. The device vibrated violently against the wood. The caller identification displayed Tyler's name in bold black letters. I did not reach for the receiver. I simply watched the device dance across the desk, allowing the electronic rings to echo through the empty room. I needed him to speak without any interruption from me. I needed him to commit his sheer desperation to a recorded medium. The ringing finally ceased, yielding to the automated voicemail system. A bright red notification dot appeared on the screen indicating a new audio message had been successfully deposited. I plugged a pair of noise-canceling headphones into the audio jack. I pressed play, analyzing the acoustic environment, before Tyler even spoke a single word. The background noise consisted of echoing footsteps, sharp acoustics, and the distinct low hum of a commercial espresso machine. He was standing at his side a large open building. A voice over a public address system faintly requested a sales manager to the front financing desk. Tyler was exactly where I predicted he would be. He was standing inside a luxury European car dealership, attempting to spend my brother's life support funds. His voice started as a harsh, strained whisper. The tone dripped with absolute humiliation and barely contained fury. He demanded to know what technical error I had caused on the family accounts. He stated he was sitting at the financing desk, attempting to process a $70,000 down payment on a performance vehicle. The senior sales manager had just returned from the back office to inform him the secondary debit card was flagged for severe fraud and permanently declined. Tyler hissed into the receiver, stating I was embarrassing him in front of highly important people. He ordered me to call the bank immediately to lift the security hold, claiming the money was legally his by birthright, and I was merely a jealous spectator blocking his inheritance. I sat completely motionless, listening to his breathing grow ragged and uneven. The background noise shifted dramatically. The echo faded, replaced by the sound of rushing traffic and blowing wind. Tyler had walked out of the dealership showroom and into the parking lot to isolate himself. The fabricated facade of a wealthy, successful heir completely evaporated. His whisper escalated into a vicious, aggressive shout. He abandoned the pretense of a banking technical glitch. He explicitly acknowledged that I had intentionally severed his access to the medical trust. He accused me of stealing his future. He claimed Gordon owed him that money for being an absent father during his childhood. The sheer entitlement radiating through the audio file was staggering. Tyler felt zero remorse for leaving his father to die alone in a sterile hospice facility while he attempted to purchase a sports car with the man's vital care funds. He viewed the medical trust purely as a delayed paycheck he was tired of waiting for. Then the rant took a dark, terrifying turn. His voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a desperate, lethal malice. Tyler delivered his ultimate ultimatum. He reminded me that as Gordon's only biological son, he held significant legal influence over the medical staff at the care center. He stated he possessed the familial authority to challenge my established medical directives. He promised that if I did not restore his access to the frozen accounts by noon, he would drive straight back to the hospice clinic. He threatened to formally instruct the attending physician to withdraw all hydration and supplementary oxygen. He explicitly vowed to end my brother's life today to force the immediate liquidation of the entire estate. He claimed he would tell the medical board I was unnaturally prolonging Gordon's suffering, against his expressed wishes and have me banned from the building. The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving a heavy, dead silence in my ears. He had just handed me a fully loaded weapon. Tyler thought he was applying insurmountable emotional leverage. He believed threatening a dying man would force my hand into opening the vault out of sheer panic. Instead, he had crossed the legal line from financial larceny directly into premeditated extortion and conspiracy to commit murder. This audio file was the exact required catalyst to destroy his life permanently. I did not feel a single shred of fear. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction taking root in my chest. I disconnected the headphones and grabbed a secure encrypted flash drive from my leather satchel. I inserted the drive into the laptop port. With methodical precision, I ripped the raw audio file directly from the cellular network carrier, ensuring the digital metadata remained entirely intact. The timestamp, the caller identification, and the exact geolocation coordinates embedded in the file provided irrefutable proof of origin. I dragged the completed file into a secure folder, labeling it simply as primary evidence. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message. I typed a single email address into the recipient line. It belonged to Roland. Decades ago, before he became a ruthless corporate litigator, Roland was a brilliant but impoverished legal clerk working night shifts at my old engineering firm. I recognized his sheer potential and quietly paid the remainder of his massive law school tuition. I never once asked for repayment. Roland went on to build a fierce national reputation as a legal shark who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He owed me a profound personal debt, and he operated with a terrifying efficiency that perfectly matched my own. I attached the volatile audio file and the compiled ledger of Tyler's fraudulent banking transactions. I did not write a lengthy emotional explanation outlining my grief. My message consisted of 3 short declarative sentences. I told Roland my nephew had fatally compromised the family trust. I instructed him to review the attached extortion threat against my brother's life. I authorized him to execute a maximum response utilizing every federal statute available to neutralize the threat. I hit send and watched the progress bar disappear into the digital ether. The response arrived less than 4 minutes later. Roland did not call to offer empty condolences. He simply replied to the email string with a singular, factual confirmation. The message stated the federal authorities were currently being notified, and a comprehensive legal trap was officially armed. He advised me to remain securely at the motel and allow Tyler to continue escalating his aggressive behavior. The trap required the predator to fully commit to the snare before the jaws could snap shut. I closed the laptop, feeling the rigid physical tension slowly leave my shoulders. The rain had started falling against the window panes again, washing the grime from the asphalt outside. Tyler was currently stranded in a dealership parking lot, fuming over his declined card and his shattered ego. He possessed my cell phone number, and the GPS tracking application on Monica's phone would inevitably point them toward my current location. They would not return to the hospice center to enact their threat just yet. Their unyielding greed would compel them to seek out the gatekeeper holding their stolen money. They would come directly to this motel to force the issue, believing they still held the superior position and the physical advantage. I poured the last cup of stale coffee from the plastic carafe and sat facing the locked wooden door, waiting patiently for the violent arrival of my nephew. The heavy rain continued to lash against the single-pane glass of the motel window. I sat perfectly still in the sagging armchair. The digital clock on the bedside table flipped to 2 in the afternoon. The confrontation was inevitable. I simply waited for the geographical tracking on my cellular device to draw them directly to my location. The silence of the cheap room shattered with a violent, deafening crash. The flimsy wooden door buckled inward. The cheap metal chain lock snapped like brittle plastic, tearing the screws right out of the drywall. The door slammed against the interior wall with a concussive bang. Tyler stood in the threshold, panting heavily. His expensive designer jacket was completely soaked, clinging to his shoulders. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped into the room, tracking mud and dirty rainwater across the faded carpet. Monica flanked him immediately, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her eyes darted around the dingy motel room, radiating absolute contempt. A third person stepped out of the pouring rain and hovered nervously in the doorway. He was a short, balding man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase against his stomach. His eyes continuously darted toward the broken doorframe, clearly terrified of the physical damage Tyler had just inflicted. Tyler did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He marched directly toward the small circular table where I was sitting. He slammed his wet palms flat against the laminate surface, leaning over until his face was inches from mine. He smelled of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and raw panic. He demanded the immediate release of the trust funds. He detailed the utter humiliation he had just endured at the luxury auto dealership. He described how the finance manager had looked at him with sheer pity when the transaction was declined for severe fraud. He blamed me entirely for his ruined morning. He declared that I was a bitter old man trying to steal his rightful inheritance out of pure spite. I did not flinch. I did not move away from his aggressive posture. I stared directly into his bloodshot eyes. I remained completely silent, depriving him of the argument he so desperately wanted to have. My lack of reaction only infuriated him further. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the cheap plastic lamp. Monica stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. She told me the games were officially over. She signaled to the nervous man lingering by the broken door. The man scurried forward, placing his heavy briefcase on the bed. He popped the brass latches and withdrew a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He pulled a heavy gold notary stamp from his pocket and placed it deliberately next to the papers. Tyler grabbed the stack of documents and tossed them onto the table directly in front of me. He pointed a trembling finger at the bottom signature line. He informed me that these were asset release forms. They were drafted to immediately dissolve the blind trust and transfer total executive control directly to him. He demanded that I surrender the master security codes and sign the relinquishment documents right there in the motel room. He stated the notary was fully prepared to witness and authorize the transfer regardless of the highly irregular circumstances. I glanced at the documents. The paperwork was a chaotic mess of legal jargon clearly downloaded from a cheap internet template and hastily modified to include Gordon's estate details. It was completely amateurish. The notary stood by, sweating profusely, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He was clearly a bribed contractor, someone Monica utilized for her shady real estate dealings, willing to validate a coerced signature for a quick cash payout. He refused to make eye contact with me, staring intently at his own shoes. I looked back at Tyler. I asked him what would happen if I simply refused to sign the fraudulent papers. Monica laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the thin walls. She stepped closer, her eyes wide and manic. She outlined their exact contingency plan with chilling precision. She promised that if I did not sign the release forms immediately, she would drive straight to the local police precinct. She would file a formal police report claiming severe elder abuse. She detailed how she would inform the authorities that I had actively isolated Gordon from his loving family. She would testify under oath that I had been systematically starving him, denying him essential medications, and locking him in his bedroom. Tyler nodded eagerly, validating her monstrous threat. He added that he would personally show the police the banking records, proving I had seized control of the medical funds. They would spin the narrative to portray me as a greedy, opportunistic brother who had hijacked a dying man's finances. Tyler stated the police would immediately secure an emergency injunction, freezing my personal assets and throwing me into a holding cell. He promised I would spend the final days of my brother's life, locked in a concrete cage facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They had crafted a flawless, malicious extortion plot. They were utilizing the legal system as a blunt instrument to terrorize me into total submission. I sat back in my chair, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I observed the frantic, desperate energy radiating from my nephew. He was a cornered animal completely dependent on my compliance to fund his lavish lifestyle and clear his hidden debts. He believed his aggressive posturing and Monica's terrifying threats had cornered me entirely. He believed I was a frightened old man isolated in a cheap motel room, completely cut off from any outside support. He was profoundly mistaken on every single front. I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. Tyler tensed, visibly bracing himself for a potential physical altercation. I withdrew a sleek silver fountain pen. I placed it gently on the laminate table next to the stack of fraudulent documents. I looked directly at the bribed notary. The nervous man swallowed hard, pulling a blue ink pen from his shirt pocket and clicking the top repeatedly. I turned my attention back to Tyler. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a calm, measured tone. I told him that his behavior was a profound disappointment, but absolutely expected. I reached out and pulled the thick stack of asset release forms toward me. Tyler let out a heavy, loud sigh of absolute relief. His aggressive posture melted away instantly, replaced by a sickening, arrogant smirk. He glanced back at Monica, shooting her a victorious look. They truly believed they had broken my resolve. They believed their sheer audacity had successfully intimidated me into surrendering the entirety of Gordon's estate. I smoothed the top page flat against the table. I deliberately moved my fountain pen to the side. I reached out and picked up the cheap blue pen the notary had placed on the table. I am a naturally right-handed man. I have spent 63 years writing exclusively with my dominant right hand. I deliberately placed the blue pen into my left hand. I gripped the plastic barrel awkwardly. I pressed the tip against the signature line on the final page of the document. I began to write. The movement was slow, clumsy, and completely unnatural. The signature looked like the chaotic scrawl of a young child learning cursive. It was shaky, disjointed, and utterly unrecognizable. I did not stop there. I deliberately misspelled my own legal surname. I transposed the vowels, replacing the letter I with an E and dropping the final consonant entirely. The signature on the paper read Calvin Robertson instead of Calvin Robertson. The legal document required absolute precision and verified identity to hold any weight in a court of law. A coerced, illegible signature featuring a misspelled surname rendered the entire contract completely null and void. I signed my fake, clumsy name on all 6 pages of the release forms. The notary eagerly stepped forward the second I finished. He did not bother to verify the spelling. He did not check my government-issued identification. He simply stamped his gold foil seal next to my terrible forgery and scribbled his own quick signature. He was eager to complete the illegal transaction and escape the tense motel room. Tyler snatched the documents off the table, clutching them tightly against his chest. He laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound of pure triumph. He looked down at me, shaking his head in mock pity. He told me I was a smart man for finally giving up the fight. He warned me never to contact him or his wife again. He stated he would take over the medical payments immediately and that I was permanently banned from visiting the hospice center. Monica chimed in, telling me to enjoy the rest of my pathetic life in this cheap motel. They turned their backs on me, marching out through the broken doorframe without a single glance backward. The nervous notary scurried out right behind them, rushing into the pouring rain. I remained seated in the chair, watching their luxury vehicle speed out of the parking lot, splashing through deep puddles. The broken door swung gently in the wind, letting the cold, damp air sweep into the room. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm settle over my entire body. I picked up my silver fountain pen, returning it to my jacket pocket. Tyler believed he held the keys to the kingdom. He was currently driving away with a stack of utterly worthless paper, totally oblivious to the massive federal trap he had just blindly walked into. The fake signature was the final necessary piece of evidence. The silent adjustment was proceeding exactly as planned. The harsh sunlight creeping through the motel blinds offered zero warmth. I sat at the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the muted television screen, completely wide awake. My phone shattered the morning silence. The caller identification displayed Roland's secure private line. I answered immediately, expecting an update on the federal wire fraud injunctions we had initiated the night before. Instead, Roland's usually booming voice carried a rare, heavy solemnity. He delivered the news with brutal efficiency. Beatrice had passed away shortly after midnight. Her fragile heart had simply given out during the storm. A deep, heavy ache settled in my chest. The sharp-witted 90-year-old woman across the hall had spent her final hours on Earth listening to predators and warning a stranger. She had saved my estate, and I never got the chance to say a proper goodbye. Roland did not call merely to offer condolences. He explained that the Oakwood Care Center administrator had contacted his office directly. When I established the protective legal perimeter around Gordon's room a week ago, I listed Roland's firm as the primary emergency contact for any external irregularities. The hospice cleaning staff had entered room 412 at dawn to prepare the space for the next arrival. While stripping the heavy hospital bed, a nurse discovered a thick, padded envelope physically taped to the underside of the metal mattress frame. The package bore my full legal name written in shaky, deliberate cursive. Roland instructed me to secure the item immediately. The facility management was holding it in their main administrative vault, unwilling to hand it over to anyone but the explicitly named recipient. I grabbed my coat and left the motel room, the cold morning air biting at my face. The drive back to Oakwood Care Center felt entirely different from my frantic escape the previous night. The adrenaline of the financial counterattack had burned away, leaving a chilling, focused dread. Tyler and Monica had been thoroughly humiliated and financially crippled by the trust lockdown. Cornered animals are unpredictable. I pulled into the visitor parking lot, navigating the puddles left by the torrential rain. The hospice building looked deceptively peaceful under the gray morning sky. I bypassed the front reception desk, marching straight down the western corridor toward the executive offices. Mrs. Higgins, the facility director, stood waiting behind her mahogany desk. She was a strict, highly professional woman who tolerated absolutely no disruptions in her wards. She recognized me instantly, having seen me sit by Gordon's side for weeks. She slid a weathered brown manila envelope across the polished wood surface. Thick layers of clear packing tape secured the flap. Mrs. Higgins explained that Beatrice must have secured it there days ago, anticipating a moment when she could not speak for herself. I thanked the director, securing the package inside my jacket. I did not head toward Gordon's room. I needed absolute privacy. I walked rapidly back out to the parking lot, locking myself inside the quiet sanctuary of my vehicle. I tore through the heavy layers of packing tape. Inside the envelope rested a small black digital voice recorder. It was a standard, inexpensive model, the kind college students use for lectures. A pale yellow sticky note clung to the back of the plastic casing. The ink was faded, reading simply, "Listen carefully." Beatrice had not just been an idle eavesdropper. She had been actively documenting the shadows in the hallway. My thumb hovered over the playback button. I pressed it down. A burst of electronic static hissed through the car speakers, followed by the ambient rhythmic hum of the hospice ventilation system. Then the distinct hushed voices of my nephew and his wife materialized. The recording quality was surprisingly crisp. They were standing directly outside Beatrice's open door, using the blind spot of the hallway corner as their private war room. The timestamp on the digital display indicated the recording captured a conversation from exactly 2 nights ago, shortly after Tyler had first arrived in town. Tyler's voice dripped with an impatient, venomous edge. He was pacing. The audio captured the squeak of his expensive leather shoes against the linoleum floor. He complained bitterly to Monica about the grueling timeline. He stated the doctors predicted Gordon could linger in a comatose state for another 2 weeks. Tyler hissed that they did not have 2 weeks. He referenced a catastrophic margin call on his offshore accounts, screaming that his creditors were threatening to seize his primary residence if he did not wire a massive lump sum by Friday. He needed the inheritance payout immediately, completely unaware at the time that the estate was locked in my blind trust. Monica's voice responded cold, flat, and entirely devoid of human empathy. She told him that waiting was for fools. She reminded him that they had full, unrestricted access to Gordon's room during the late evening shift when the nursing staff conducted their floor rotations. The audio captured a heavy, pregnant silence. Then Tyler outlined the execution. He spoke in rapid, hushed tones, detailing a horrifyingly specific medical loophole. Tyler instructed Monica to procure a highly concentrated vial of unprescribed liquid sedatives. He claimed a contact in Seattle had already supplied the narcotic. He explained the exact mechanics of the intravenous drip connected to his dying father. He told his wife that injecting a massive lethal dose directly into the secondary port of the IV line would overwhelm Gordon's weakened respiratory system in a matter of minutes. Tyler bragged that the attending physicians would absolutely assume Gordon simply slipped away naturally from his terminal cancer. He noted that hospice patients are rarely subjected to exhaustive chemical autopsies unless foul play is blatantly obvious. They were going to accelerate the timeline. They were going to murder my brother to trigger a life insurance and estate payout they desperately craved. The recording captured Monica agreeing without a single hesitation. She demanded to know the exact schedule. Tyler told her they would execute the injection tonight, utilizing the chaotic shift change at midnight to slip into the room unnoticed. He told her to prepare the syringe and keep it hidden in her handbag. The audio ended with the sharp, distinct click of the stop button. Beatrice had turned off the machine, terrified they would hear the mechanical beep. I sat in the driver's seat, the cold plastic of the recorder pressing into my palm. My breath hitched in my throat. The reality of the situation crashed down upon me with the weight of a collapsing building. The financial retaliation I executed this morning from the motel room was a defensive maneuver. It had crippled their bank accounts, but it had fundamentally backed them into a desperate, lethal corner. By severing their access to the medical funds and the property equity, I had inadvertently accelerated their panic. If Tyler was willing to murder his father 2 days ago, for convenience, the total financial freeze would undoubtedly push him to execute the lethal injection out of pure, unadulterated vengeance. This was no longer a battle over stolen money, vintage vinyl records, or legal power of attorney documents. This was an active, ticking countdown to premeditated homicide. Tyler held a loaded syringe and Gordon lay completely defenseless in a hospital bed just a few hundred yards away from where I sat. I grabbed my phone, bypassing the standard dial pad, and connected directly to Roland's secure line. The time for silent adjustments had officially ended. I needed federal warrants. I needed armed officers. And I needed to breach that hospice corridor before the clock struck midnight. I called Roland from the damp interior of my vehicle parked outside the hospice center. He did not waste a single second with unnecessary questions. Within 20 agonizing minutes, a heavy black sport utility vehicle pulled into the empty space directly next to my car. Roland stepped out into the freezing torrential rain, carrying his signature leather briefcase. He was flanked by 2 massive, imposing men dressed in dark tactical clothing. These were Officers Miller and Vance, 2 highly decorated off-duty police veterans operating under Roland's expensive private retainer. We synchronized our watches in the freezing downpour. The operation required absolute surgical precision. There was no room for hesitation. We walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of the Oakwood Care Center, moving with a terrifying unified purpose. The night receptionist looked up from her illuminated desk, her eyes widening at the sight of 4 soaking wet men marching into the quiet lobby. Roland flashed a severe silver badge and a heavily notarized manila folder, instructing the frightened woman to remain exactly where she was, and explicitly commanding her to silence all overhead paging systems. The rubber soles of our shoes squeaked aggressively against the polished, sterile linoleum. The hospital corridor smelled intensely of industrial bleach and impending grief, a scent that usually suffocated my lungs, but tonight it actively fueled my adrenaline. We bypassed the central nurses' station without slowing our pace. Officer Miller unclipped his shoulder radio, delivering a silent hand signal to his partner. Vance instantly broke away from our formation, taking the flanking route through the eastern stairwell to strategically block any secondary escape paths. We approached the isolated wing where my dying brother lay. The corridor was unnaturally quiet, bathed in a flickering fluorescent glow. 50 feet away, I spotted Monica. She was leaning casually against the pale yellow wall directly outside Gordon's open door, scrolling mindlessly through her cellular phone. She was acting as the designated lookout, while her husband prepared to execute his own father. Her utter nonchalance, her sheer casual posture in the face of premeditated murder, sent a wave of pure, absolute revulsion coursing through my veins. Monica finally looked up from her digital screen. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly manicured face the second she registered the two massive officers stepping into the harsh overhead light. She opened her mouth, preparing to shout a desperate warning into the room. But Officer Miller closed the physical distance with terrifying, unnatural speed. He placed a heavy gloved hand firmly on her shoulder, pressing her aggressively back against the drywall. He ordered her to keep her mouth entirely shut. I did not wait to observe her reaction. I shoved the heavy wooden door to room 414 wide open. The room was bathed in the pale, rhythmic blue glow of the vital sign monitors. The mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator provided a steady underlying beat to the unfolding nightmare. Tyler was standing directly over the hospital bed, leaning heavily over the metal railing. He had bypassed the primary intravenous saline bag and was holding a large, clear plastic syringe directly above the secondary injection port. His thumb rested heavily on the plastic plunger. The sharp steel needle hovered mere millimeters from the rubber seal of the intravenous line. He froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent intrusion. His head snapped toward the doorway. The look in his eyes was not guilt or remorse. It was the feral, cornered panic of a predator caught firmly in an inescapable snare. He looked at me, then his eyes darted to Roland and finally locked onto the heavy tactical holsters resting securely on the officer's hips. The arrogant, untouchable facade he had worn for weeks disintegrated in a fraction of a second, exposing the cowardly opportunist underneath. Officer Vance commanded him to drop the weapon, his deep voice echoing like a physical blow in the quiet clinical room. Tyler's hand began to shake violently, his fingers spasming out of pure terror. The syringe slipped from his sweaty grip. It hit the hard linoleum floor with a sharp, sickening crack. The plastic casing fractured instantly, and a thick, clear liquid pooled around the shattered needle, mixing with the sterile dust on the floor. Tyler did not attempt to formulate a lie. He did not drop to his knees and beg for familial mercy. Pure survival instinct completely overrode whatever rational thought he had left in his brain. He lunged backward, knocking over a rolling tray table filled with medical supplies. Metal instruments clattered loudly to the ground. He bolted toward the open doorway, violently shoving past his own wife. Monica stumbled and crashed hard into the corridor wall, crying out in shock. Tyler hit the heavy metal crash bar of the emergency fire exit at the very end of the hall. The door flew open into the raging storm, triggering a deafening, pulsing red alarm that instantly shattered the silence of the entire care center. Roland barked an order over the blaring siren, instructing the officers not to pursue the fleeing suspect. He declared that we had the physical evidence and Tyler was exactly where we wanted him to be. Officer Miller immediately knelt beside the shattered syringe, ignoring the blaring alarms. He pulled a thick pair of latex gloves from his tactical vest and produced a rigid plastic biohazard container from his belt. He carefully, meticulously scooped the fractured plastic casing, the broken needle, and the pooled liquid into the secure receptacle, sealing it with a definitive, loud snap. The lethal dose of unprescribed sedatives was now officially chain of custody evidence. It was the undeniable physical manifestation of attempted homicide preserved perfectly for the impending federal indictment. I ignored the ensuing chaos unfolding in the hallway. I stepped past the spilled medical supplies and walked directly to the side of the hospital bed. Gordon was sleeping peacefully. His chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence, completely unaware of the violent nightmare that had just been narrowly averted inches from his face. The oxygen machine continued its steady, reliable hiss, pumping life into his failing lungs. I placed my trembling hand over his cold, fragile fingers. I closed my eyes, letting out a long, ragged breath that I felt I had been holding for hours. We had made it. The margin of error had been less than 10 terrifying seconds. I stood over my older brother, promising him silently that the predators would never come near his bedside again. I would ensure his final days were spent in absolute uncorrupted peace. Roland was already executing the next phase of the strategy. The facility administrator came sprinting down the hallway, flanked by 2 panicked night nurses rushing toward the blaring fire alarm. Roland intercepted them smoothly before they could even look inside the room. He handed the breathless administrator a thick, heavily stamped legal packet. It was a comprehensive protective injunction drafted and authorized by a federal judge within the last hour. Roland explained in a cold, authoritative tone that Tyler and his wife were now officially the primary subjects of an active attempted homicide investigation. He demanded that Gordon's room be immediately placed under 24-hour private security lockdown. No unauthorized medical personnel, no extended family members, and absolutely no outside visitors were permitted to cross the threshold without my explicit written consent. The administrator, pale and visibly shaken by the presence of armed police and biohazard containers, nodded frantically, agreeing to every single demand. She immediately ordered the nursing staff to comply with the legal injunction and secure the perimeter. Officer Vance took up a permanent physical position outside the heavy wooden door, crossing his muscular arms and visually surveying the corridor. The immediate physical threat was entirely neutralized. The chemical weapon was legally secured. Tyler was currently sprinting through the freezing rain, a desperate fugitive from justice, with absolutely no access to his frozen bank accounts, no legal claim to my property, and a federal warrant rapidly closing in on his location. The silent adjustment had officially shifted from a defensive maneuver into an absolute uncompromising offense. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when my cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of Roland's conference table. It was a relentless mechanical buzzing. I ignored it at first, pouring a cup of black coffee from the carafe. The phone did not stop. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. Messages poured in not from Tyler or Monica, but from numbers I had not seen in years. I swiped the screen, unlocking a digital nightmare. Monica had weaponized the internet overnight. Cornered and desperate after fleeing the hospice, she had launched a highly coordinated, vicious social media campaign. She sat in front of a ring light, her face streaked with perfectly orchestrated tears, recording a live broadcast. Her voice trembled with practiced vulnerability. She told thousands of strangers that I was a dangerously unstable man. She spun a fabricated narrative claiming I was suffering from severe senile dementia and hoarding tendencies. She told the camera I had forcibly isolated Gordon, taking advantage of his illness to lock his only loving son out of his rightful family home. The video was heavily edited, splicing out of context audio clips of my voice from years ago to make me sound completely unhinged. She showed fake photographs of my house filled with trash, claiming I was forcing Gordon to live in squalor before moving him to a hospice facility against his will. The broadcast painted me as a violent captor, and Tyler as the desperately grieving son, just trying to save his dying father. The digital community swallowed the poison whole. Local community groups shared the video thousands of times within hours. Outrage is a highly addictive currency online, and Monica was handing it out for free. Total strangers left hundreds of vile comments under the video demanding my immediate arrest. They called me a monster, an abuser, a selfish parasite preying on a sick man. The viral infection spread rapidly to our extended relatives. Cousins and aunts who had not bothered to visit Gordon once during his grueling chemotherapy treatments suddenly felt entitled to hurl moral judgments. The text messages flooding my phone were laced with absolute disgust. A cousin from Chicago told me I was a disgrace to the family name. An aunt from Florida threatened to call Adult Protective Services if I did not let Tyler back into the house immediately. They bought the narrative completely. It is always easier for distant relatives to digest a dramatic lie than to confront the ugly truth of their own prolonged absence. They needed a villain to blame for Gordon's tragic decline, and Monica had handed them a perfect target on a silver platter. The sheer volume of hatred was designed to break my spirit. Monica wanted me to panic. She wanted me to log online and defend myself in a chaotic public screaming match. She wanted me to look exactly like the unhinged, unstable old man she claimed I was. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the vicious insults from people who shared my blood. I felt a brief, sharp sting of betrayal, but I did not type a single letter in response. I did not record a counter video. I simply reached out and pressed the power button on the side of the device, holding it down until the screen faded to pitch black. I tossed the silent phone into my leather satchel. Digital noise is ultimately weightless. It holds absolutely zero legal authority in a federal courtroom. I refused to fight a desperate woman in the court of public opinion when I was preparing to obliterate her entirely in a court of law. I turned my attention back to the massive oak table spanning the center of Roland's private office. The room was a fortress of quiet efficiency located on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise completely insulated from the manufactured chaos unfolding online. Roland stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the waking city. He held a thick file folder completely unbothered by Monica's internet theatrics. He operated exclusively in the realm of tangible, undeniable facts. He placed the folder onto the table, spreading out the physical manifestations of Tyler and Monica's impending doom. We possessed three distinct, unassailable pillars of evidence. The first was the secure digital drive containing the complete transaction logs from the blind trust. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tyler had committed felony wire fraud, utilizing a forged secondary debit card to drain $50,000 meant for Gordon's life support. The digital footprints mapped directly to Tyler's personal internet protocol address. The second pillar lay right next to the drive. It was a high-resolution scan of the asset release forms I had signed in the motel room. The paperwork clearly showed my deliberately misspelled surname and the clumsy left-handed forgery. Beside it, Roland had placed the official record of the corrupt notary public. Roland's investigators had spent the early morning hours uncovering a long history of fraudulent property transfers associated with that specific notary stamp, connecting him directly to Monica's shady real estate dealings. The paperwork was not just void, it was a documented conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The final and most devastating piece of evidence rested in the center of the oak table. It was a certified copy of the chain of custody report filed by Officer Miller just hours ago. The document detailed the exact recovery of the shattered plastic syringe and the pooled liquid from the floor of room 414. The hospice facility's internal security cameras had captured high-definition footage of Tyler sprinting through the emergency exit. His face twisted in absolute terror, exactly 2 seconds after dropping the lethal weapon. The biohazard container was currently sitting in a secure federal laboratory undergoing expedited chemical analysis. Preliminary reports already indicated a massive lethal concentration of unprescribed respiratory sedatives, confirming Beatrice's recorded warning. Roland tapped a heavy gold pen against the forensic report. He spoke with a cold, clinical satisfaction. He explained that Monica's social media campaign was actually a massive tactical error on her part. By publishing those videos, she was establishing a public record of her extreme desperation to access the estate. She was providing the prosecution with documented proof of motive. She thought she was building a victim narrative, but she was actually tying her own noose. Roland gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the table to align the stack perfectly. He informed me that the federal magistrate was expecting him in private chambers at 11 o'clock. We were not pursuing state-level elder abuse charges. The combination of crossing state lines to commit wire fraud, forging legal documents to seize property, and attempting to inject a lethal narcotic elevated the entire situation into a multi-agency federal jurisdiction. Roland slid the compiled dossier into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet office. He looked at me, his eyes fierce and unyielding. He promised that by sunset, the digital noise would be completely silenced by the deafening reality of federal indictments. I nodded slowly, taking a slow sip of black coffee. The trap was set, the evidence was flawless, and the final strike was imminent. I sat at the small wooden desk in my motel room, watching the glowing screen of my laptop. Roland had sent me a secure direct link to Monica's public social media page. She had scheduled a live broadcast for exactly noon, specifically chosen to maximize her daytime viewership and capture the attention of people on their lunch breaks. I clicked the link and watched my own living room appear on the digital feed. Monica had staged the background meticulously to support her fabricated narrative. She had dragged my favorite reading chair out of the frame and replaced it with a prominent display of framed photographs showing her and Tyler smiling next to Gordon during much healthier days. It was a carefully curated set designed entirely to manipulate the emotions of thousands of gullible strangers. She sat in the center of the frame wearing a simple, modest sweater, with her makeup done to look intentionally tired and distressed. She stared directly into the camera lens, forcing a single tear to roll down her cheek as she began her monologue about family loyalty and elder abuse. She told her viewers that they were living in a state of constant terror. She claimed she and Tyler were currently barricaded inside their rightful family home, terrified that I would send violent men to forcibly remove them. She stated they were completely out of funds because I had maliciously frozen the bank accounts out of pure spite to prevent Tyler from seeking proper medical care for his dying father. The comments section on the side of the screen scrolled rapidly, with messages of support and outrage from people who had absolutely no idea they were funding a predator. Monica dabbed her eyes with a tissue, asking for digital donations to help them hire a defense attorney to rescue Gordon from my supposed captivity. It was a brilliant masterclass in digital extortion. She was monetizing her own lies while sitting comfortably on my imported Italian leather sofa. I simply watched the digital clock on the bottom right corner of my screen. Roland had assured me the timing of his tactical strike would be absolute perfection. At exactly 12:14, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the laptop speakers. Monica froze mid-sentence. She looked toward the hallway, her eyes widening with a mixture of genuine surprise and calculated theatrical fear. She picked up the mobile device, turning the camera to show the heavy wooden front door of my house. She whispered to her audience that this might be the violent thugs I had supposedly hired to harass them. She walked slowly toward the entryway, intentionally amplifying the dramatic tension for her viewers. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open, expecting to find a delivery driver or perhaps a sympathetic neighbor she could use for extra content. Instead, a massive, broad-shouldered man in a dark tailored suit stood on the porch. He did not look like a neighborhood supporter or a delivery worker. He was a highly specialized tactical process server, operating exclusively under Roland's elite corporate retainer. The man held a thick, heavily bound stack of legal folders secured with red federal seals. He looked directly at the camera lens and then down at Monica. His voice was loud, clear, and entirely devoid of emotion, ringing out like a heavy bell. He stated her full legal name and asked for verbal confirmation of her identity. Monica, completely caught off guard, stammered a hesitant affirmative response. The process server immediately thrust the heavy stack of documents directly into her free hand. He did not mince words or offer any pleasantries. He spoke with absolute legal precision, ensuring the microphone on her phone picked up every single syllable. He formally announced that she had just been served with a federal indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Monica let out a sharp gasp, fumbling with the heavy folders as she tried to balance the recording device in her other hand. The live chat on the side of my screen instantly stopped its rapid scrolling. The process server did not stop to allow her to process the initial shock. He continued his verbal declaration, stating she was holding a 24-hour emergency eviction mandate authorized by a federal district judge. He explicitly clarified that the property she was currently occupying belonged entirely and exclusively to the Gordon Robertson Blind Trust. He stated for the permanent digital record that neither she nor her husband Tyler possessed any legal claim title or inheritance rights to the premises. He informed her that she was legally classified as a hostile trespasser. If the property was not entirely vacated and the keys surrendered by noon the following day, armed federal marshals would arrive to physically remove her and her belongings. The color completely vanished from Monica's face. Her jaw went slack as she stared down at the red seals stamped across the eviction notice. The false narrative she had spent the last 48 hours building was suddenly colliding with the crushing, unyielding weight of reality. The process server delivered the final devastating blow before she could formulate a single defensive word. He pointed to the thickest folder at the bottom of the stack, resting against her arm. He announced that she and Tyler were formally named as co-defendants in a secondary civil lawsuit demanding the immediate and total restitution of the $50,000 stolen from the medical care accounts. He clarified that the total sum was now compounding daily, with extreme punitive interest rates attached, and that their future wages would be heavily garnished until the debt was entirely settled. The man turned his back and walked briskly down the driveway, disappearing into a dark sedan parked on the street. Monica stood completely frozen in the open doorway, holding the undeniable physical proof of her impending ruin. The cold autumn wind blew past her, rustling the pages of the federal indictment. I shifted my gaze to the live comment sections on the right side of the video feed. The initial wave of sympathetic messages had completely vanished. The viewers had heard every single word the process server delivered. The digital tide turned with brutal immediate speed. People began demanding explanations for the wire fraud accusations. They asked why she was begging for donations if she was living in a house she did not even own. The monetary donations abruptly stopped. The outrage that Monica had so carefully cultivated and directed toward me instantly boomeranged directly back at her. The strangers who had defended her a minute ago were now tearing her apart in the chat, demanding their money back and calling her a scam artist. Monica finally looked down at the screen of her device. She saw the absolute flood of angry, demanding comments scrolling endlessly past her face. Her fabricated victim persona completely shattered in real time. The soft, vulnerable woman she had portrayed just moments ago evaporated entirely, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic and rage. She let out a loud, piercing shriek of pure frustration. She dropped the heavy legal folders onto the hardwood floor, the papers spilling out in a chaotic white mess across the entryway rug. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with the screen, desperately trying to find the button to end the live broadcast. The camera jerked wildly, capturing the messy pile of eviction notices and federal indictments scattered across the floor. With one final frantic swipe, the video feed abruptly cut out, plunging my laptop screen into a welcome black silence. I closed the web browser, feeling a cold, satisfying calm settle deep within my bones. The illusion she had tried to sell to the world had been systematically dismantled on her very own platform. She was now fully aware that she was occupying a fortress built entirely on lies, and the walls were rapidly caving in. She had no money, no legal standing, and absolutely nowhere to hide from the impending federal consequences. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a short message to Roland. I confirmed that the service had been executed successfully and highly publicly. I did not waste time gloating over the victory. I simply requested the confirmed arrival time for the federal marshals the following day. The house needed to be completely cleared and sanitized before I could safely return. I leaned back in the motel chair, letting the quiet isolation of the room wash over me. The predators had been formally cornered, stripped of their digital armor, and the final trap was officially armed. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator finally ceased its mechanical labor, just as the evening sun dipped below the tree line outside the hospice window. I sat beside the narrow hospital bed, gripping Gordon's fragile hand. His skin was paper-thin and remarkably cold to the touch. The relentless battle against his failing biology ended with a quiet, simple exhalation. There were no dramatic final words and no sudden bursts of clarity. The deep, heavy tension that had gripped his facial muscles for months simply melted away, leaving behind a profound stillness. I pressed my thumb against his wrist, confirming the absence of a pulse, before reaching out to press the call button for the attending nurse. The medical staff moved into the room with practiced silent efficiency, confirming the time of death and gently drawing the thin white sheet over his face. I did not shed a tear in that sterile room. My grief was a private, solitary weight anchored deep in my chest. The predators had been kept completely at bay, allowing my brother to depart this world with the absolute dignity he fundamentally deserved. I signed the necessary medical release forms and walked out of the care center into the cool night air. The real war was no longer about protecting a dying man. It was about permanently neutralizing the threat to his legacy. 2 days later, the community gathered at the historic brick chapel on the eastern edge of town to formally mourn Gordon Robertson. The heavy wooden pews were packed shoulder to shoulder with people who had known my brother through his decades of honest engineering work. Local business owners, former employees, and distant relatives filled the narrow aisles holding damp tissues and speaking in hushed, respectful tones. I sat dead center in the very front row, wearing a dark tailored suit, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. I did not engage in the superficial pleasantries unfolding around the floral arrangements near the entrance. I simply stared at the polished oak urn resting on the elevated marble altar. The murmuring voices created a low, steady hum that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel suddenly groaned open, cutting through the muted conversations. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, starting from the back rows and washing rapidly toward the front. I listened to the sharp, confident click of expensive leather shoes striking the stone floor. Tyler had miraculously surfaced. He was a wanted fugitive currently actively evading federal marshals and local law enforcement, yet his monumental arrogance compelled him to walk directly into a crowded public building. He bypassed the grieving guests marching straight down the center aisle, with his head held high. He wore a brand-new, immaculate black designer suit that fit his shoulders perfectly. A crisp white shirt and a subdued silk tie completed his fabricated costume of mourning. Tyler reached the front of the chapel and completely ignored my presence. He stepped smoothly around the altar, climbing the 2 short steps to the wooden podium. He gripped the edges of the lectern tightly, bowing his head for a long, calculated moment of silence. The entire congregation held its collective breath, completely captivated by the sudden, dramatic arrival of the grieving son. Tyler slowly raised his face to the crowd. His eyes were expertly reddened, swimming with forced tears that he heroically refused to let fall. He leaned into the microphone, letting out a ragged, shuddering sigh that resonated loudly through the chapel speakers. He began his speech with a trembling voice, thanking everyone for coming to honor his beloved father. He painted a vivid, fictitious picture of a deep, unbreakable bond between a father and son, tragically severed by illness. His tone shifted deliberately, darkening as he scanned the faces in the pews. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, sitting motionless in the front row. He declared with absolute conviction that I was an abusive, manipulative monster. He told the silent crowd that I had forcefully kidnapped Gordon during his weakest, most vulnerable state. He spun a horrifying narrative detailing how I had changed the locks on the family home and deployed private armed security to violently physically bar a loving son from holding his dying father's hand. The congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Disgusted glares burned into the back of my neck. Tyler fed on their shock, escalating his performance to new heights. He claimed that I had illegally seized the family trust funds, leaving him completely destitute and unable to afford basic medical treatments that could have saved Gordon's life. He stated with tears streaming down his face that his father had died completely alone, terrified and wondering why his only son had abandoned him. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast colorful, fragmented shadows across Tyler's expensive black suit as he continued his vicious character assassination. He recounted completely fictional childhood memories, claiming Gordon had always warned him about my jealous and destructive nature. Tyler expertly wove these blatant lies into his broader victim narrative, ensuring every single anecdote positioned me as the lifelong villain of their family dynamic. He described false scenarios where I had supposedly embezzled funds from Gordon's engineering business decades ago, setting a precedent for the ultimate theft of the medical trust. The sheer brazenness of his performance was staggering. He was constructing an elaborate labyrinth of deceit directly in front of the man who possessed the irrefutable evidence to destroy him. I listened to the rustle of clothing as members of the congregation leaned forward, completely absorbed by the scandalous accusations. Several of Gordon's former business partners sat just 2 rows behind me, muttering in quiet outrage. The collective mood of the chapel was rapidly souring, turning into a palpable hostile energy directed entirely at the back of my head. Tyler fed off this shifting dynamic, challenging anyone in the room to look into my eyes and find a single shred of human decency. He dramatically pulled a white handkerchief from his breast pocket, pressing it against his eyes to stifle a theatrical sob. He begged the congregation to help him secure justice for his father. He demanded their moral and legal support to reclaim the stolen estate from my tyrannical grip. He asked the crowd to bear witness to his suffering and to stand with him against the unimaginable cruelty I had supposedly inflicted. He finished his monologue, wiping a solitary tear from his cheek, and stepped away from the microphone to the sound of scattered sympathetic applause from the back rows. I remained seated in the front pew, my expression carved from solid granite. I did not stand up to defend myself against the vicious public slander. I did not interrupt his theatrical performance. I simply watched his hands trembling slightly at his sides, knowing the federal authorities were currently monitoring his cellular network pings to pinpoint this exact location. Tyler believed his charismatic speech had completely turned the community against me, thereby securing his ultimate victory. He was completely oblivious to the unmarked black vehicles quietly pulling up to the curb outside the chapel doors. I kept my eyes locked on the polished wooden urn, waiting patiently for the final act of this tragic performance to conclude. The scattered applause from the back rows faded into a heavy, somber silence. Tyler stood at the wooden lectern, soaking in the manufactured sympathy of the crowded room. I did not wait for the pastor to return to the altar. I stood up from the front pew. The sudden movement drew the immediate attention of the mourners sitting directly behind me. I did not look at any of them. I turned my back on the polished oak urn and walked with deliberate, measured steps straight down the center aisle. The heavy soles of my shoes clicked rhythmically against the cold stone floor, echoing in the vast, quiet space. The congregation watched me with a mixture of confusion and lingering hostility, planted by the venomous speech of my nephew. They expected me to flee the chapel in shame. They expected me to retreat from the public condemnation. I walked straight past the murmuring relatives and the glaring former business partners. I maintained a completely blank expression, ignoring the heavy weight of their collective judgment. My destination was the elevated audio-visual booth located at the very back of the chapel, nestled just below the choir loft. The small booth was enclosed by a low wooden partition. A young technician in a wrinkled white shirt sat behind a complex digital soundboard, pressing buttons to cue the solemn organ music scheduled for the closing prayer. He looked up in sheer surprise as I stepped into his cramped workspace. I did not ask for permission. I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved the secure encrypted flash drive. The technician opened his mouth to protest my intrusion, raising a hand to block my access to the main console. I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not speak a single word. The absolute cold finality in my gaze froze him completely in his tracks. He lowered his hand and slowly backed away from the control panel, yielding the space without a fight. I scanned the illuminated buttons and sliders identifying the primary auxiliary input port. I inserted the metal drive into the slot. The digital screen immediately recognized the external device displaying the 2 isolated audio files I had meticulously prepared. I reached out and rested my fingers on the master volume slider. I pushed it upward, ensuring the audio would feed directly into the massive high-fidelity speakers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. I pressed play on the first track. A sharp burst of electronic static hissed through the chapel speakers, immediately silencing the low murmurs of the congregation. The sudden noise cut through the heavy air like a physical blade. Then the ambient hum of the hospice ventilation system filled the room. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, turning their heads toward the back of the chapel, trying to locate the source of the unexpected sound. The confusion transformed into absolute shock as the voice of Tyler suddenly echoed off the stone walls. It was not the trembling, sorrowful tone he had just utilized at the podium. It was a harsh, impatient whisper dripping with malice and greed. The entire congregation sat paralyzed as they listened to the unmistakable sound of the grieving son complaining bitterly to his wife about his mounting offshore debts. The audio played with terrifying clarity. Every single person in the room heard Tyler explicitly outline his plan to procure unprescribed liquid sedatives. They heard him explain the mechanics of the intravenous drip connected to his dying father. They listened in total, horrifying silence as he instructed Monica to inject a lethal dose into the secondary port to accelerate the inheritance payout before I could legally intervene. The people sitting in the wooden pews stopped breathing. The older relatives who had just sent me vile text messages covered their mouths in sheer disbelief. The former business associates of Gordon stared blankly ahead, their faces draining of all color, as the reality of the premeditated murder plot washed over them. The first recording ended with a sharp click, leaving a brief, agonizing vacuum in the chapel. I did not give them a single moment to recover or rationalize what they had just heard. I instantly cued the second track. The digital beep of my motel voicemail echoed through the room. The voice of Tyler returned, this time amplified into a vicious, aggressive shout. The audio captured his complete unhinged meltdown in the dealership parking lot. The congregation listened as he explicitly acknowledged that I had severed his access to the medical trust. They heard his lethal ultimatum. His voice vibrated with pure malice as he promised to drive back to the hospice clinic and instruct the attending physician to withdraw all hydration and supplementary oxygen. He vowed to end the life of his own father to force the immediate liquidation of the entire estate. The recording captured his explicit threat to tell the medical board I was unnaturally prolonging the suffering of Gordon against his expressed wishes. The words hung in the air, painting a portrait of a monster, willing to weaponize the medical system to murder his own flesh and blood for cash. The voicemail ended. The digital feed cut out, leaving the chapel submerged in a heavy, suffocating silence. It was not the respectful quiet of a memorial service. It was the deadly, toxic silence of absolute horror. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzed every single person in the room. The false narrative Monica had spun online disintegrated into ash. The vicious smear campaign was completely obliterated by the undeniable reality of the recorded voice filling the chapel. The congregation slowly, collectively turned their heads back toward the front of the room. Tyler remained frozen behind the wooden podium. His hands gripped the edges of the lectern so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The immaculate designer suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap theatrical costume. The arrogant, untouchable facade he had projected mere minutes ago shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The color vanished entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He looked like a corpse standing upright. He stared out at the sea of disgusted, horrified faces staring back at him. The people who had just offered him their deepest sympathies now looked at him as if he were a venomous snake. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He had spent weeks constructing an elaborate labyrinth of deceit, manipulating everyone around him, playing the role of the devoted son to perfection. He had utilized every ounce of his charm and cunning to paint me as the villain. Now his own words had meticulously, flawlessly destroyed him in front of the exact audience he sought to manipulate. I stood quietly in the audio-visual booth, watching the psychological collapse of my nephew from the elevated vantage point. I felt no joy and no triumph. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction that the truth had finally completely sterilized the room. The eyes of Tyler darted frantically around the chapel, searching desperately for an escape route, for a friendly face, for a single shred of the support he had commanded just moments before. He found absolutely nothing. He was entirely, totally isolated. He was standing on an island of his own malicious creation. The protective injunctions, the frozen bank accounts, the intercepted syringe, and now the public broadcast were all links in a chain that had finally pulled completely taut. Tyler slowly released his grip on the podium, his arms falling limply to his sides. His shoulders slumped forward as the crushing weight of his inevitable future crashed down upon him. He knew the federal authorities were waiting just beyond the heavy oak doors. He knew the digital evidence was irrefutable. He stood entirely silent beneath the stained glass windows, finally confronting the total, absolute annihilation of his life. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the chapel swung open with a resounding thud that shook the ancient timber frames. A brilliant shaft of midday sunlight sliced violently through the muted, somber atmosphere of the sanctuary, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. 4 towering figures stepped over the threshold into the dim interior. They did not pause to remove their hats or offer any respectful gestures to the religious setting. They were federal investigators operating under the highest level of jurisdictional authority. Their arrival was the direct mathematical result of Roland monitoring the cellular network pings and feeding real-time geographical coordinates straight to the regional field office. The timing was an act of absolute surgical precision. The agents moved in a synchronized tactical formation, spreading out to secure the main entryways before proceeding forward. The heavy rubber soles of their tactical boots struck the smooth stone floor in a rhythmic, intimidating cadence that completely overpowered the residual silence of the room. The congregation seated in the wooden pews instinctively recoiled. Relatives and former business associates pressed themselves back against the hardwood benches, pulling their coats tight around their shoulders as the intimidating men marched directly down the center aisle. Tyler remained trapped on the elevated marble altar, holding a front-row ticket to his own total annihilation. He possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the federal agents closing the physical distance between them. The fabricated tears he had shed just moments ago completely evaporated, leaving his face a mask of pale, unadulterated terror. He released his death grip on the wooden podium, taking a small, involuntary step backward. His expensive leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the polished stone. He looked to his left and then to his right, frantically searching for a hidden exit behind the choir loft. But his legs refused to obey his panicked brain. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer gravitational weight of his impending consequences. The lead investigator, a broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and a stern, uncompromising expression, reached the front row of the pews. He did not slow his pace as he ascended the 2 short carpeted steps onto the altar. The investigator bypassed the floral arrangements and marched straight up to the podium. He did not lower his voice to respect the sanctity of the memorial service. He spoke with a booming, authoritative volume designed specifically to leave absolutely zero room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. He addressed Tyler by his full legal name, confirming his identity for the official record. Tyler opened his mouth to formulate a response, but his vocal cords failed completely, producing only a faint, pathetic wheeze. The agent did not wait for verbal confirmation. He reached out with a massive hand and gripped Tyler firmly by the shoulder, spinning him around with forceful, undeniable authority. The agent pulled both of Tyler's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place echoed loudly throughout the vaulted ceiling of the chapel. It was the definitive sound of a predator losing his freedom. The lead investigator maintained his loud, projecting tone as he formally delivered the federal charges to the trembling man. He stated that Tyler was being taken into immediate custody for the attempted homicide of a vulnerable elder. A collective gasp erupted from the congregation as the horrifying reality of the audio broadcast was legally validated right in front of their eyes. The agent continued down the list of severe federal infractions. He cited grand financial larceny, explicitly referencing the fraudulent draining of the medical trust funds across state lines. He concluded the verbal indictment by charging Tyler with aggravated identity fraud, detailing the creation of the fake debit cards and the coercion of the corrupt notary public. The entire catalog of Tyler's deceitful, malicious actions was laid bare under the bright stained glass windows. Tyler slumped forward, his perfectly tailored black designer suit bunching awkwardly around the rigid steel chain binding his wrists. He looked out at the sea of disgusted faces staring back at him. The business partners, the distant cousins, the community leaders, they all looked at him with sheer revulsion. The very people who had sent me vile messages earlier that morning now stared at Tyler with profound, unconcealed hatred. His meticulously crafted reputation was permanently reduced to ash. While the lead investigator secured Tyler at the altar, Monica realized the walls of the trap had fully closed. She was sitting in the third row near the center aisle, but her survival instinct immediately kicked into overdrive. She did not spare a single glance of sympathy or concern for her husband. She abandoned him instantly, calculating her own odds of evasion. She slid silently down the smooth wooden bench, moving away from the center aisle and creeping toward the eastern transept. The shadows cast by the towering marble columns provided a brief temporary cover for her movements. She kept her head down, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, navigating the narrow space between the side pews and the exterior wall. Her target was the heavy brass handle of the side emergency exit, located just beneath the organ pipes. She moved with frantic, desperate speed, believing she had successfully outsmarted the federal perimeter. She reached the side alcove and threw her weight forward, grabbing the brass handle with both hands. Before she could pull the lever downward, the heavy door was forcefully yanked open from the outside. The sudden movement threw Monica completely off balance, causing her to stumble backward onto the stone floor. A tall, athletic female federal officer stepped into the doorway, completely blocking the exit path. The sunlight behind the officer cast a long, imposing shadow directly over Monica. The officer looked down at her with cold, professional detachment. She held a thick, printed document bearing the red seal of a federal magistrate. The officer did not give Monica a chance to speak or deploy her usual manipulative charm. She clearly and concisely presented the active warrant for criminal conspiracy. She detailed Monica's direct participation in the attempted lethal injection and her complicity in the systematic wire fraud. Monica let out a shrill, indignant shriek, scrambling backward on the floor. She attempted to shout her innocence, claiming she was merely a bystander who had been manipulated by her husband. Her victim narrative fell on completely deaf ears. The female officer stepped forward with fluid, practiced efficiency, pulling Monica up by her elbows and swiftly securing her wrists with a second pair of steel handcuffs. Monica kicked and thrashed her immaculate morning attire, gathering dust from the floor as her composure entirely disintegrated. The pristine facade she utilized to deceive the internet was completely gone, revealing the feral panic underneath. The lead investigator guided Tyler down from the altar, marching him up the center aisle. The female officer merged into the procession, forcefully walking Monica right behind her husband. The two predators were paraded directly through the center of the congregation. The silence in the chapel was absolute and unbroken. No one stood up to defend them. No one offered a single word of comfort. The community simply watched the physical manifestation of justice remove the toxic infection from their presence. The agents pushed open the heavy front doors, dragging Tyler and Monica out of the dim, somber chapel and into the harsh, blinding daylight of the afternoon. The federal transport vehicles sat idling at the curb, ready to transport them to a holding facility where their frozen bank accounts and fabricated lies could offer absolutely no protection. I remained standing quietly in the audiovisual booth, observing the empty center aisle. The loud, heavy click of the wooden doors shutting behind the investigators signaled the absolute end of the confrontation. The silent adjustment had reached its ultimate, unyielding conclusion. The legacy of my brother was perfectly secure, and the predators had been permanently excised from our lives. The air inside the federal interrogation room tasted like stale coffee and floor wax. Monica sat rigidly on a bolted metal chair, glaring at the scuffed surface of the steel table bolted to the concrete floor. She had spent the last 3 hours demanding to speak with the lead investigator, treating the federal agents like incompetent bellhops who had simply misplaced her luggage. Her wrists were chafed from the heavy steel handcuffs, but her profound arrogance remained entirely intact. She repeatedly demanded access to her personal cellular phone, insisting she needed to contact her offshore banker in the Cayman Islands to arrange an immediate wire transfer for her bail. She firmly believed this entire ordeal was a temporary inconvenience, a minor administrative error that her vast financial resources would swiftly resolve. She yelled at the mirrored glass, demanding a glass of sparkling water and threatening to sue the entire department for unlawful detainment. She calculated her net worth in her head, reassuring herself that she possessed enough liquid capital to hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in the country. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her financial fortress had already been leveled to the ground. The heavy steel door clicked and swung inward. Roland stepped into the cramped, windowless room. He looked entirely out of place in the grim holding facility, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit and carrying his signature leather briefcase. He did not pull out a chair or offer a polite greeting. He stood on the opposite side of the metal table looking down at Monica with the cold, detached observation of a scientist examining a captured insect. Monica immediately scoffed at his arrival, assuming he was there to represent the estate in some futile attempt to negotiate a surrender. She leaned forward, rattling the chain connecting her handcuffs to the table ring. She boldly informed Roland that her wealth completely dwarfed whatever legal budget he possessed. She sneered and told him to relay a message to me stating she would tie the estate up in endless litigation until the legal fees bled me dry. She promised to post bail within the hour and hire a team of corporate sharks to destroy us both. Roland did not blink. He did not raise his voice to counter her venomous threats. He calmly unlatched the brass locks on his briefcase and withdrew a single crisp document bearing the embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice. He placed the paper face up on the scratched metal table directly in front of her. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority, explaining the exact nature of the document. It was a comprehensive federal asset freeze order signed by a district judge just 1 hour ago. He watched the smug confidence falter slightly in her eyes as she looked down at the official signatures. Roland explained the precise mechanics of her total downfall. He detailed how the $50,000 Tyler had fraudulently drained from Gordon's life support trust had not simply vanished. The federal investigators had easily tracked the digital routing numbers straight into Monica's personal offshore portfolio. Roland elaborated on the fatal error of her greed. By intentionally commingling stolen domestic medical funds with her international investments, she had triggered a cascade of severe federal money laundering and wire fraud statutes. The government did not just seize the stolen $50,000. Because the stolen money had touched her offshore accounts, the Department of Justice legally classified her entire financial portfolio as the active proceeds of a criminal conspiracy. Every single dollar she had hoarded, every real estate holding, every hidden mutual fund, and every offshore trust had been instantly frozen and seized as evidence in an active federal felony investigation. She was entirely, completely, and irrevocably penniless. She did not possess a single cent to post bail. She could not afford a public defender, let alone a team of elite corporate attorneys. Her vast wealth was now the property of the federal government. Monica stared at the freeze order as the color rapidly drained from her face. Her breathing turned shallow and erratic. The illusion of her invincibility shattered instantly, leaving her utterly exposed to the crushing reality of her circumstances. Roland did not stop pressing his advantage. He informed her that the grand larceny and wire fraud charges were secondary to the primary offense. He reminded her of the audio recordings broadcasted throughout the chapel. The federal prosecutors were moving forward with charges of being a primary accessory to attempted elder homicide. He stated clearly that crossing state lines to facilitate a lethal injection carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He watched her process the mathematical certainty of spending the next 2 decades behind concrete walls wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, completely stripped of her luxury and status. The transformation was swift and pathetic. The haughty, entitled woman who had just threatened to destroy me financially completely collapsed into a desperate, terrified shell. Monica began to hyperventilate, pulling frantically against the steel chains binding her wrists to the table. She looked up at Roland with wide, panicked eyes. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the raw, desperate instinct of a trapped animal. She immediately turned on her husband, without a second thought. She leaned across the table, begging Roland to speak with the federal prosecutors on her behalf. She offered to testify against Tyler in open court. She promised to reveal every single detail of his plan, swearing she had only gone along with the murder plot because she was terrified of his temper. She completely fabricated a new narrative portraying herself as a battered, manipulated wife, desperate for a way out. She cried genuine tears of fear, offering to hand over passcodes, text messages, and email histories if Roland would just secure her a plea deal to avoid prison time. She babbled uncontrollably, promising to waive all claims to the estate, to sign any document I wanted, and to publicly confess her crimes if it meant she could walk out of the precinct. She pleaded with Roland, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine, begging for a sliver of mercy. She promised she would disappear and never contact our family again. She clawed at the metal table, trying to reach the freeze order, as if she could tear it up and reverse time. Roland listened to her desperate, pathetic begging without a single change in his expression. He did not offer her a tissue. He did not offer a shred of false hope. He simply let her exhaust herself, watching her drown in the consequences of her own malicious actions. The federal investigators had absolute proof of her willing participation. They possessed the audio recordings, the financial footprints, and the physical evidence. They did not need a single word of her testimony to secure a maximum conviction. She had absolutely zero leverage and nothing of value left to trade. Roland reached out and calmly picked up the federal freeze order, sliding it neatly back into his leather briefcase. He secured the brass locks with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed loudly in the small concrete room, silencing her frantic begging. He looked at Monica one final time, completely ignoring her tear-streaked face and trembling hands. He simply tapped his fingers twice against the smooth leather of his briefcase. He turned his back on her and walked toward the heavy steel door. Monica screamed his name, begging him not to leave her alone in the cold, sterile room. Roland did not look back. He opened the door and stepped out into the busy hallway, letting the heavy metal door slam shut behind him, sealing Monica in absolute, unforgiving silence. The tires of my heavy sedan crunched softly against the familiar gravel of the long driveway. The property stood perfectly silent beneath the crisp light of the late afternoon sun. I stepped out of the vehicle, breathing in the cool autumn air. The immediate visual contamination of Tyler and Monica's brief occupation remained an ugly scar on the immaculate landscaping. A rusted commercial dumpster sat awkwardly on the front lawn, overflowing with discarded cardboard boxes, broken hangers, and cheap decorative items they had frantically attempted to drag out before the federal marshals enforced the eviction mandate. The pristine grass beneath the heavy steel bin was completely crushed and yellowing. I did not waste a single moment staring at the debris. I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket and contacted a specialized biohazard and luxury restoration crew I had vetted earlier that morning. They arrived within 30 minutes, operating with strict military efficiency. A massive flatbed truck reversed onto the property, hooking thick steel cables to the overflowing dumpster. The hydraulic winch groaned loudly as it hoisted the heavy container off the lawn, permanently removing the physical manifestation of their greed from my sight. The restoration crew moved seamlessly into the main house, carrying industrial cleaning supplies and heavy-duty equipment. I walked through the hallway, inspecting the superficial damage left behind. Black scuff marks traced the white baseboards where heavy suitcases had been carelessly dragged. The polished oak floor bore deep scratches near the entryway. The crew immediately began buffing the wood, applying fresh coats of sealant that smelled sharply of pine and chemical wax. They scrubbed the walls, erasing the smudgy fingerprints and the lingering scent of artificial perfume. I hired a private contractor to repair the damaged drywall in the guest bedroom, where Tyler had violently kicked a hole during his panicked realization of the impending federal indictments. The contractor measured the damage, cutting precise squares of fresh gypsum board and applying smooth layers of white plaster. I paid them double their standard hourly rate to expedite the process, demanding absolute perfection. The house needed to be completely sanitized, sterilized of their toxic presence before I could begin the true process of reclamation. A team of landscapers arrived shortly after, laying down fresh sod over the damaged lawn and planting vibrant new shrubs along the walkway. By nightfall, the property smelled exclusively of fresh lemon polish, clean linens, and wet earth. With the house entirely empty and immaculate, I walked out to the detached garage. The air inside the uninsulated structure was cool and stagnant. I bypassed the stacked moving boxes and approached a sturdy, reinforced travel trunk tucked away in the back corner. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps, opening the lid to reveal my meticulously preserved collection of vintage vinyl records. I sifted through the thick cardboard sleeves, pulling out a specific pristine pressing of a classic 1950s jazz album. It was a rare original recording featuring a legendary tenor saxophone solo that Gordon absolutely adored. I carried the record back into the main house, stepping into the center of the immaculate living room. I placed the vinyl carefully onto the platter of my high-fidelity turntable, lowering the delicate needle into the outer groove. The speakers crackled softly for a split second, before the rich, warm sound of the saxophone flooded the entire house. The music swelled, filling the empty corridors with a profound, resonant beauty. I sat down on the Italian leather sofa, closing my eyes and letting the complex, rhythmic melodies wash over me. The sharp brass notes and the deep rhythmic bass created a protective auditory shield around the property. It was a tangible tribute to my brother, a celebration of his exquisite taste, and a permanent declaration that the sanctuary had been completely restored. The following morning, I walked upstairs and opened the double doors to the sprawling master suite. The massive room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic views of the distant hills, had always felt too cavernous for simple residential living. I visualized a completely different utility for the space. I hired a team of commercial interior designers to execute a rapid, comprehensive conversion. They stripped the residential carpeting, replacing it with sleek, soundproof acoustic flooring. They installed a massive mahogany conference table in the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather executive chairs. Heavy oak filing cabinets lined the walls, transforming the luxurious bedroom into a highly functional, secure command center. Secure server racks were bolted into the walk-in closet, establishing an encrypted digital network isolated from the main residential grid. This was the physical birthplace of the Beatrice Adler Foundation. I officially filed the corporate paperwork, utilizing a portion of the fully recovered and heavily compounded medical trust to endow the charitable organization. The mission statement was precise and fiercely uncompromising. The foundation existed solely to provide immediate, aggressive legal protection for elderly patients suffering from severe familial financial exploitation. I retained Roland on a permanent advisory basis, utilizing his vast network of forensic accountants and tactical investigators. We built a specialized response team capable of intervening within hours of a verified report. The foundation did not simply offer passive legal advice. We provided emergency housing, bridging the dangerous gap when a vulnerable patient needed immediate extraction from a toxic domestic environment. I purchased a small, secure apartment complex on the northern edge of the city, outfitting each unit with advanced medical monitoring equipment and 24-hour private security. We established a secure, confidential hotline, allowing hospice nurses and medical practitioners to bypass traditional slow-moving state agencies and report suspected abuse directly to our tactical unit. The intake process was rigorous but highly efficient. Within the first month of operation, we successfully intercepted 3 separate cases of blatant elder fraud. One case involved a nephew attempting to forge a warranty deed to seize his aunt's property. Our investigators secured the falsified documents and handed them directly to the federal prosecutor, resulting in immediate felony charges and asset freezes. Another intervention rescued an 80-year-old widow from a daughter who was illegally siphoning her pension to fund a severe offshore gambling addiction. We moved the widow into our secure housing facility within 4 hours of the initial call, instantly locking the compromised bank accounts and securing her physical safety. A third case involved a caretaker deliberately withholding prescribed medication to accelerate cognitive decline and trigger a power of attorney clause. Our rapid response medical team intervened, stabilizing the patient, while Roland filed emergency injunctions to strip the abuser of all legal authority. The foundation operated with the exact same cold, calculating precision that had dismantled the predators in my own life. We did not negotiate with abusers. We did not offer warnings or second chances. We gathered irrefutable evidence and executed devastating legal strikes that completely incapacitated the exploiters before they even realized they were under formal investigation. The mahogany tables of the converted master suite quickly filled with secure physical dossiers, mapping out the financial rescue of dozens of vulnerable individuals. The jazz music continued to play softly from the downstairs living room, drifting up the staircase and mingling with the quiet, efficient hum of the foundation operations. The house was no longer simply a quiet retirement property. It had evolved into a fortified bastion of justice, radiating a powerful protective influence across the entire region. The legacy of my brother was not defined by the tragic circumstances of his decline, but by the relentless, unyielding machine of protection erected directly in his honor. Every successful intervention, every frozen fraudulent account, and every rescued patient served as a permanent, undeniable testament to the absolute triumph of truth over deception. The crisp morning air settled over the quiet suburban street, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. 6 months had passed since the heavy federal doors slammed shut on the darkest chapter of my existence. I sat comfortably in the weathered rocking chair on my front porch, holding a thick ceramic mug of strong black coffee. The dark liquid radiated a comforting heat against my palms. I watched the golden sunlight slowly crest the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the immaculate green lawn. The neighborhood was completely still, entirely devoid of the chaotic, malicious energy that had once threatened to consume this property. The rusted commercial dumpster, the trampled grass, and the suffocating tension were permanent things of the past. The physical environment now perfectly mirrored the profound psychological silence reigning within my own mind. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The quiet isolation of the morning was not a symbol of loneliness. It was the ultimate reward of a flawlessly executed defense. The structural integrity of my peace was built directly upon the absolute ruin of those who had sought to destroy my family. Tyler and Monica were currently waking up to a radically different reality. The federal justice system had processed their extensive crimes with mechanical, terrifying efficiency. There were no lenient plea deals and no sympathetic judges swayed by fabricated tears. The overwhelming mountain of digital recordings, financial trails, and intercepted biohazard evidence had completely buried their expensive defense attorneys. They were both handed maximum sentences for their central roles in the conspiracy. The federal magistrate explicitly denied any possibility of early parole, citing the extreme predatory nature of their actions against a vulnerable dying man. Tyler had traded his immaculate custom-tailored suits for a coarse, brightly colored institutional uniform. He was currently confined within the high-security wing of a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his arrogance, his influence, and his stolen wealth. His days were now dictated by harsh fluorescent lights, heavy steel doors, and the rigid, unforgiving schedule of the prison warden. Monica was incarcerated in a separate facility, entirely isolated from the offshore accounts she had desperately worshipped. The luxury vehicles, the exotic vacations, and the carefully curated social media personas were permanently erased. They were both entirely forgotten by the world they had tried to manipulate, left to rot in the sterile concrete boxes they rightfully earned. I shifted my weight in the rocking chair, looking back through the large bay window into the main living room. The space was completely transformed. The lingering ghosts of my brother's painful decline had been gently escorted out of the property. I had lost Gordon to an aggressive biological failure, but I had successfully salvaged his fundamental human dignity. He did not die in a state of terror surrounded by predators calculating the monetary value of his final breath. He passed away in a secure, quiet environment, completely shielded from the malicious greed of his own flesh and blood. The polished oak urn resting on the mantelpiece was no longer a symbol of profound grief. It served as a permanent silent monument to the enduring strength of familial loyalty. I had honored my brother not by shedding useless tears, but by systematically annihilating the absolute worst elements of his legacy. His memory was now a clean, untarnished slate permanently protected from the toxic ambition of his offspring. The sprawling master suite on the second floor of the house was now the beating heart of a completely new enterprise. The Beatrice Adler Foundation was operating at maximum capacity. What had begun as a desperate defensive maneuver had rapidly evolved into a highly sophisticated tactical organization. The soundproofed walls and secure server racks hummed with constant vital activity. I had utilized a significant portion of the fully recovered medical trust to expand our operational reach across the entire state. Roland had assembled an elite task force composed of retired forensic accountants, former federal investigators, and aggressive litigation specialists. We did not wait for the slow-turning wheels of the traditional legal system to intervene on behalf of the vulnerable. The Foundation operated as an immediate rapid response unit. We established a secure network of emergency safe houses entirely off the grid, designed specifically to shelter elderly individuals who needed immediate extraction from financially abusive domestic environments. The Foundation deployed tactical legal strikes, freezing contested assets, securing emergency medical injunctions, and completely isolating predators before they could finalize their malicious schemes. The very trap I had engineered to destroy Tyler and Monica was now a standardized weapon deployed daily to protect the defenseless. My cellular phone vibrated sharply against the wooden table next to my chair, breaking the quiet rhythm of the morning. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a secure, encrypted message from one of our lead field volunteers. I tapped the notification, opening a high-resolution photograph. The image captured the exterior of one of our newly acquired private sanctuary apartments. An elderly man with a shock of white hair stood in the open doorway. He was clutching a small canvas duffel bag to his chest. His posture was slightly stooped, bearing the heavy, invisible weight of prolonged emotional and financial manipulation. A younger Foundation volunteer stood right beside him, resting a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. I zoomed in on the face of the elderly man. The deep lines of anxiety and sheer terror that normally accompanied such extractions were noticeably absent. Instead, his eyes were wide and bright, reflecting the warm sunlight, spilling into the clean, secure hallway. He was stepping over the threshold into a place where his bank accounts could not be drained, his medication could not be withheld, and his fundamental safety was completely, absolutely guaranteed. He was stepping into total freedom. I stared at the digital image for a long, profound moment. The photograph represented the absolute culmination of the entire agonizing ordeal. Every sleepless night, every calculated maneuver, and every brutal confrontation had directly paved the road to this exact outcome. The darkness Tyler and Monica had attempted to inject into the world had been forcibly converted into a massive sweeping light. The pain of losing Gordon was significantly dulled by the undeniable reality that his tragedy had birthed a relentless machine of protection. I locked the screen of the phone and placed it back onto the wooden table. I leaned back against the comfortable fabric of the rocking chair, resting my hands on the armrests. I closed my eyes and took a slow, incredibly deep breath, drawing the crisp morning air into my lungs. The invisible heavy tension that had resided in my shoulders for the better part of a year finally completely dissolved. I opened my eyes and looked out at the rising sun. I had orchestrated the perfect silent adjustment. I had not relied on emotional outbursts or frantic public pleas. I had simply gathered the raw, undeniable facts and allowed the absolute truth to execute its own flawless, devastating justice. The war was officially permanently over, and the sanctuary was secure. If you found this story compelling, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more content.